Yeah. Come tonight and hear the rest of that. 6 o'clock right here. The kids are going to be leading us in Christmas worship tonight. You know, doctors used to do this thing where if you got sick, they would come to your house and actually minister to you while you were sick right there at your, have fun. Actually minister to you right there while you were at your house. Now, that sounds really outrageous nowadays, but they used to do this thing. I think they called it house calls. House calls. Doctor come to your house when you're actually sick. It's hard to find people who do house calls anymore. They're out there. In fact, I read about one this week. His name is Jason Ornung. He's in Grand Junction, Colorado. Jason does house calls. Okay? So, unfortunately, Jason's not a doctor. He's a barber, okay? So, you know, maybe you're still sick, but at least you look tidy. You know, so you'd have Jason come over and cut your hair. House calls. We would expect in this generation for a technological solution, something that you could do with your iPad or your iPhone. And sure enough, there it is. Someone has come up with a company where you can have a virtual house call on your iPhone or iPhone or iPad. iPhone, that covers them both, doesn't it? iPad. But you have a doctor come to you electronically and make a sort of a pseudo or virtual house call. So this has already been going on for a while, but it turns out that it's kind of the results are sort of mixed. You know, it's a little impersonal. It doesn't work as well as having the real person right there with you. You know, Jesus makes house calls, and that's good news for all of us. In fact, he made the greatest house call ever, and actually that's what Christmas is all about. It's about the greatest house call that a physician ever made, and we run into that in the text that we come to this morning in our journey through Matthew. I invite you to get your New Testament out and join me in Matthew chapter 9. We're on verse 9. Get your bulletin out, turn it over, pencil or pen. We'll write a few notes as we go along here. Jesus making the greatest house call ever. Matthew chapter 9 and verse 9 says this, that as Jesus was going out from there, he saw a man sitting at the tax booth. He was called Matthew. And he says to him, "Follow me." And he got up and he followed him. Now, the verse starts by saying that Jesus was going out from there, from a certain place. And all we have to do is look back at the previous verses and we see what Matthew is referring to. Jesus has just finished having a controversy with the religious leaders over his assertion that he can forgive sins. This is the first time in the book of Matthew that he did this. He forgave a man's sins, and the religious leaders who were sitting around said, "Wait a minute. Who does this man think he is?" That is the prerogative of God himself, to forgive somebody's sins the way that Jesus was doing. But Jesus proved that he had the power, the authority, and the power to forgive sins by healing this man's physical ailment. He was paralyzed, and Jesus did that to prove that he had the authority to forgive sins. So now, with that in mind, that's the context, obviously, that Matthew wants us to be thinking about in the way that he starts verse 9. Jesus goes out from there. He's in Capernaum, and he sees a man sitting at the tax booth. That would have been on the edge of town. They had tax booths where goods came into a town, where they would be taxed as they entered into a new jurisdiction. And so Matthew is one of these guys sitting out here watching goods come into the city, counting them, weighing them, whatever they had to do, calculating them, tabulating them, and then collecting the taxes that would then go to Rome. And notice that it is Matthew. He's careful to tell us in verse 9 that this particular tax collector that Jesus sees sitting at the edge of town is named Matthew. So this is the fella who wrote the gospel that we're going through, Matthew. He's giving us an account of his call to follow Jesus. And it's probably highly compressed. Maybe there was more discussion. Maybe Matthew had already known about Jesus. We don't know. He just leaves all of that out. He just tells us that Jesus comes along, says, "Follow me." Matthew gets up and he leaves, just like Simon Peter and Andrew had done, just like James and John had done when they were down fishing. Jesus came along, said, "Come follow me." They left everything behind, and they followed them. Dramatic change in their life, big commitments. And so Matthew, the writer of our gospel, gives us this account of his calling. And his name, by the way, has a meaning. All of these first century names had meanings, and Matthew means gift of God. Gift of God. Now, the idea that he's following Jesus is important for Matthew because in his gospel, when he talks about following Jesus, he's talking about discipleship. The idea of being a follower or a learner of Jesus, someone who has placed Jesus in a position in life where he has authority. If you're a Christian this morning, then you are a follower of Jesus, you're a disciple of Jesus. There came a time when Jesus called you by the power of his Spirit, you responded to him, and you said, "Yes, I want to be." You may have said, "I want to be saved" at that point because you were, but you were not only saved, you were made a follower of Jesus, a disciple of Jesus, a learner of Jesus. And even though we cannot see Jesus with our physical eyes the way Matthew did, the Spirit of Christ is in our hearts once we're saved. And so we follow Jesus by listening to his voice through his word, through his Spirit, through the things that he reveals to us. And he leads us just as surely as he led Matthew walking out away from that booth. Now look what happens next here in verse 10. It says that when he was reclining at the table in the house, look, many tax collectors and sinners were coming, and they were sharing the table with Jesus and with his disciples. Now when it says here that they were reclining, that Jesus and the others were reclining, we want to get this picture in our mind of the way that they ate their meals, especially their banquets and their feasts. And this reclining always indicates that this is more than just a regular meal. That chances are that this was a special banquet, some kind of feast that was put on, probably by Matthew for Jesus at this point. And what they would do is they had very low tables, and they would throw pillows and mats around the tables, and then they would lie down with their head toward the table and their body stretched out behind and lean on one arm and take food off the table and eat. And they could stay there for a long time and just relax and talk and enjoy the food and so forth. And so this is the picture that's going on here. And it says that many tax collectors and sinners, many people who are in the social group of Matthew, the picture here is that Matthew has found something very special in Jesus, and he wants all of his friends and neighbors and those that he's acquainted with, he wants them to experience Jesus as well. And so the implication is that Matthew has thrown a banquet, invited all of his friends, the tax collectors and sinners, and they have come to share the table with Jesus. Now this is significant because in the first century, it's true today, but it was more formalized back then. In the first century, to share the table with somebody was something. You didn't just do that with anybody. You didn't just eat with anybody. And when you had somebody over to your house, and when they came, and when you got down and reclined at the table and ate with them, that sent a message. There was a message of some kind of friendship or connection that is taking place. Now, there's always got to be a fly in the ointment, right? And there is in this episode as well. Look what happens in the next verse, verse 11. When the Pharisees saw, here comes our fly in the ointment. When the Pharisees saw, they were saying to his disciples, Jesus' disciples, "Why is your teacher eating with tax collectors and sinners?" Here comes the tension in the story. Here's the tension in the episodes. Here's the problem that creates the need for a solution, okay? Remember, the Pharisees are part of the religious establishment in Jesus' day. And here's where the connection to the previous episode comes in. Jesus just had a go-around with the religious establishments. They just accused him of blasphemy for forgiving a man his sins. And now he goes and does something else that they consider to be beyond the pale, something that is not acceptable. And we have to understand who the Pharisees are to see why they are so outraged, why they're even asking this question in the first place. To them, the world was divided into those who kept themselves ritually pure and clean, and they were acceptable to God, and everybody else. And everybody else was dirty, they were unclean, and they were unacceptable to God. And because of that, the Pharisees were very careful about who they interacted with. If it was one of these sinners or tax collectors, they certainly didn't want to have anything to do with them, because any interaction that they had with them would drag them down, make them unclean, and make them dirty in the eyes of God. That's what they thought. And that's the way that they lived their life. Now, they've reached a point already where they're just looking for reasons to accuse Jesus. And they find one here. Because they would never sit at a table and share a meal with these lowlifes that Jesus is hanging around with at Matthew's house. They're shocked. Now, why they don't ask Jesus, I don't know. I don't know if they couldn't get to him, or if he was still in the house and they refused to go in, or they were afraid of him because he kind of made them look like fools the last time they did this by healing the paralyzed man, and everybody praised God, and they just kind of had to go out with their heads hung down. But whatever the reason is, they come to the disciples and they begin to accuse Jesus to the disciples. Look at what your teacher's doing. He's hanging around with these tax collectors and sinners. Now that was a formula that was used back then. Tax collectors and sinners. That they used that phrase for all these people that they considered to be unworthy of God and unworthy of themselves, unworthy to sit at the table with. Notice in this phrase that one group gets singled out. Yeah, it's not the sheep herders and the sinners. It's not the farmers and the sinners. It's not even the used car salesman and the sinners. It's the tax collectors and the sinners. So of all the groups that they considered to be unclean, the tax collectors were especially despised. Yeah, probably because they had to deal with the Romans, probably because they collected too much tax a lot of times, and, well, let me just put it this way. How much love do we have for the IRS agents in the United States of America? Okay? It's not really that hard to understand. They were especially despised. And so for Jesus to go and pick one of them to come and be one of his inner circle and then go to his house and hang out with his friends, why, the Pharisees' only response to that is this: can you believe it? And so they go and they ask the disciples. But the question's there. Why choose such a despised man? Why is Jesus doing that? That's the first question on your outline. Let's give it an answer this morning. The Pharisees may have been wrong, but they raise good questions occasionally that deserve answers. What is Jesus up to? Why didn't he go to Jerusalem and pick people from the establishment? Why didn't he go down to the temple and find those who were honored by all of the people and invite them to come in and be part of his inner circle? Wouldn't he have more political capital with the people if he chose those who were already leaders? Why is he going out here to the edge of town and picking someone that everybody agrees is despised? Well, part of the answer, you've learned from me that there's always usually a negative side and a positive side to these answers. Here's the negative side to this answer. Here's what Jesus is not trying to do. Let's write it down. This is clear already from 8 chapters of the book of Matthew. Jesus did not come to win everyone's approval. That is just plain as day. Now, time after time, Jesus does things that would put him in a position of not being popular. At one time, we saw that when he saw the crowds, he left. Now, people who are trying to be popular go toward the crowds. Jesus goes away from them. Another time, we saw 2 men came up, and they said that they would follow Jesus, and Jesus deflected them. He kind of picked them apart and found something wrong with their commitments and caused them to question themselves. Now, somebody who's trying to be popular doesn't do that. At another place, Jesus came into the town and cast out some demons, and they were so unhappy with him, they asked him to leave, and he just said, okay, I'm out of here. And he left. People who are trying to gain the approval of culture and be popular don't act the way Jesus does. That is not his goal. And church, this is important for us today because I fear that a lot of times the church in the United States of America has as a goal to win the approval of the culture. It ain't going to happen. Well, let me back that up. Maybe we could win the approval of the culture, but we would have to compromise our beliefs and our passions so much that you would no longer recognize who we are. And Jesus apparently knew that from the very beginning, and we could learn a valuable lesson from him and say, we're not here to win people's approval. We're here to win people's souls. And sometimes you'll be disapproved when you go out to win souls. We could win the approval of the culture and lose souls. That would be a poor choice. We wouldn't be faithful followers of Jesus were we to do that. Well, notice that Jesus asks his question, the Pharisees ask their question of not Jesus, but of the disciples. But they never answer. They never answer. Here's another time in these episodes where I would love to have more detail. Because it says in the next verse, verse 12, if you look at it, it says that when Jesus heard, he said, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. So Jesus hears this accusation that the religious establishment types are making against him to his disciples. Maybe they were doing it to his disciples to try to create some division, sow some dissent. I don't know. But the disciples either don't have time to or don't know how to answer. Maybe the disciples themselves were scratching their head and thinking, I don't know. You know, I felt kind of uncomfortable when we came in here, to be honest with you. This whole idea of sitting down with these tax collectors and sinners, that's not the way I was raised. And I wasn't going to say anything. You know, he's Jesus and all, but now that you bring it up, I'm not so sure about it. I don't know if that's what they were thinking or not. The text doesn't tell us. It just says that they never answered. Jesus has to jump in and answer. If they were uncomfortable, it wouldn't surprise me. Jesus will take us places that will make us uncomfortable. We've seen that. That's one of the first things you learn about following Jesus, is he goes places and he does things and you think, wow, this is not the way that I normally live my life. These are not the people that I normally interact with. This makes me uncomfortable. But for whatever reason, Jesus is the one that gives the answer. And look at the answer that he gives. He says it's not the strong or the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. Now, what he's saying here is pretty clear. They would have got it. It doesn't need interpretation. He's telling them, look, I know these people need help. He's not defending them. He's not justifying them. He doesn't get mad at the Pharisees and say, who are you to call them sinners? They're not sinners. They're people just like you. He doesn't do any of that. In fact, he pretty much agrees with them. He says, yeah, they're sick. I know that. That's why I'm here. Because I came to heal them. That's the whole point of me being here. And so Jesus he's comparing sin with physical illness. This is always an interesting equation. We looked at it last time because when Jesus healed the paralyzed man, he seemed to make a connection between the paralysis and the man's sin, but we looked carefully at it and saw that the connection that he made in that particular case was not cause and effect. He wasn't saying that the man's sin caused his paralysis. In fact, he forgave his sin and the man was still paralyzed. It wasn't until he actually healed the paralysis that he got up and walked. The connection that he was making there is that if he has the power and authority to heal physical ailments, then he also has the power and the authority to heal spiritual ailments. And now what we're hearing from him today is that sin, disobeying God, doing things that break God's commandment, make a soul sick. When we disobey God, it's a disease in our spirit. And Jesus says it's one that needs to be healed, and that he is the one that is capable of healing that disease. And it's a terminal disease. Sin is a disease that leads to death. It's got to be dealt with. It can't be left alone. But some people would still be uncomfortable. The question here is Jesus' interaction. I think he gives a good, strong answer, but still we have the question. Here's the second one on your outline. Is Jesus, when he goes and he hangs around with these tax collectors and sinners, he eats with them, he shares the table with them, especially considering how they viewed the table, is Jesus approving of sinful lifestyles? It's a tough question. It's one that we deal with. Is Jesus approving sinful lifestyles? Well, here's how I put it. Write this down. Jesus is not becoming a sinner. Matthew is becoming a disciple. Jesus is not being influenced by them. They didn't invite him to come and be one of them. Jesus is inviting them to come and be one of his. If you're wondering about a friendship or an interaction in your life, ask yourself this question. Is this friendship causing me to be tempted and dragged down in sin, or is this friendship causing the other person to be challenged and to step up and to grow and to face the claims of Christ? Which way is the influence flowing? Now, I will tell you today that if the influence is flowing from the sinner to you and you're being dragged down, then that's probably not a good friendship. You need to go and get stronger before you can do that. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be there. It's obvious that Jesus says we need to be there. If we're going to follow him, we're going to be there. But we also need to be wise. I remember the first time that I went out to do street evangelism in the early 1990s, and it scared me to death because I was going back to the places that I had come from, the places where all the drugs and so forth were happening. That was where I had lived. That was my culture for years and years and years. And to go back out there was a little frightening to me. But there had been several years from the time that the Lord brought me out of that community until he sent me back in as an evangelist. And in those intervening years, God prepared me to do that. And one of the greatest feelings in my entire life was to walk back out on the street into that entire environment, an environment that I knew so well because I'd spent so many years in it. I knew the smells and the sounds and the sights. I knew it all, the feeling, everything to it. But the minute I walked back out there, the greatest thing for me was to know, hey, I don't belong here anymore. This is not my place. And then I could be there, and it didn't bother me. The fact that it wasn't my place meant that I could go there, and the influence would flow from me toward them and not from them to me. So that's the question that we need to ask ourselves. Not should we be having these friendships, but which ones and when and how. We know the why, because people are sick and they need to be healed. And Jesus is a friend of sinners. You know, Jesus is even a friend of these religious establishment types. You know, he doesn't just write them off. He's pretty harsh on them. He's pretty hard on them, but a lot of them got saved too. A lot of them caused trouble when they got saved, but they got saved. Look what Jesus says to them. He's not through with them. In verse 13, he says, go learn what this means. Mercy is what I desire, and not sacrifice. I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners. Now, notice what he does here. First of all, he does something that he's very good at, and it really agitated and irritated these guys. He insults them. And I'm not saying that you should go out and insult people, but sometimes what we do is insulting. It's just a fact. And Jesus says you need to go and learn what this means. He's talking to the teachers of Israel. And he's sending them back to school. He's telling them, you flunked. You need to go back to class. And I guarantee you they were unhappy with this. And their hostility grows. But the thing about it is, even among their ranks, there were some who were saying, this guy, he's touching my heart. He's pulling me in. The Nicodemuses and so forth, they were touched by Jesus. And so Jesus goes on. He sends them back. He sends them back to the Old Testament. He's quoting from Hosea 6:6. We heard it just a few moments ago. Bo read it to us. It was a time in Israel's history where they were struggling with their spirituality. They were all just what's on the outside. You know, they wanted to go to church and look good and make everybody think that things were going well for them, and we've got it all together. But really inside, they were dying. Inside, they were dying. And God came to him and he said, look, I want you to be real. I don't want you to just come and offer your sacrifices. I want to see mercy, love, peace. I want to see the fruit of the Spirit in your life. And mercy is the one thing that he points out here. And the last thing that Jesus says here, look at it, he says, I didn't come to call the righteous. You know, this is ironic because there was nobody standing there who was righteous. Those religious establishment types, talking about how these tax collectors and sinners were unworthy, it's kind of like two men who both just fell into the river with nothing but their street clothes on, arguing about which one is wettest. One might be wetter than the other one, but it really doesn't make much difference. They're both wet. And everyone that was listening to Jesus was a sinner. Paul really had this, it kept him very humble. He always remembered, I am chief of sinners. Even though God was using him in a mighty way and he was growing, he didn't let it hold him back, but he let it keep him humble and remember where he had come from. So Jesus is saying here, I didn't come to just hang out with these folks and affirm their lifestyle. I didn't come to be one of them. I came to make them one of me. I came to call them. That word is so important. Kaleo, he said, I came to call them, not to hang out with them. There's an invitation here, and the invitation is to come and follow him. Matthew had received that invitation, and he wanted others to, and Jesus did as well. So here's the last thing. What is Jesus saying to them with all of this? He's saying two things. He's saying that they should marvel at God's mercy, first of all. They should marvel at the fact that God sent someone who would go to the tax collectors and sinners, and listen to this, church, and be so strong spiritually that instead of being dragged down by them, he pulled them up and pulled them out of the fire. Now, Jesus already demonstrated this, again, in a very physical way that was unforgettable. Back at the beginning of chapter 8, remember, a man with leprosy came out to him, and when a man with leprosy approaches, the whole crowd had one of those moments where they're wondering, what's he going to do now? Because we need to turn and get out of here. Here's this man is unclean. And then Jesus reaches his hand out, and then there's a double moment. What's he doing? Is he going to touch the man? Is he crazy? And he does. He touches the man. But Jesus doesn't get dirty. The man gets clean. Jesus is telling us something very, very important here, very graphically. He wants us to see it. We go out there where people have needs because we have the answer. Not to be dragged down by them, but to pull them up. That's why I came. You know, church, this really is what Christmas is all about. I get irritated. I should never watch TV. I'm not even sure I should listen to the radio. I can't tell you how many times I've almost thrown my radio out in the backyard. The only reason I haven't thrown my TV out there is it wouldn't fit through the window, you know. I get so mad. And the way that things are presented in popular culture, like Christmas. Christmas is about giving. Well, yeah, but I think there's more to it than that. Christmas is about giving. Christmas is about the mercy of God. Christmas is about the greatest house call that any doctor ever made. You see, because Jesus Christ stepped down from the throne, the right hand of God, and he emptied himself of his glory, and he came down to earth where all of us are who are sick and need a house call, and he touched us with his hands. And he didn't get dirty, we got clean. That's the greatest house call that anybody ever made. That's Christmas. That's Christmas, okay? So we should marvel at God's mercy. I hope you marvel at God's mercy. I do. Because I can still look back like Paul did and see where I came from and say, there ain't no reason I should be here. Don't deserve it. Never will. I marvel at the grace and the mercy of God. Do you join me in that today? I hope you do. And Christmas is a time for marveling at the mercy of grace. But there's more mercy of God. There's more to it here. What's the last part of this? They should marvel at God's mercy and model it. when you get God's mercy, it's always too big for any one life. God's mercy doesn't fit in one life. It's too big. If you try to squeeze it into your life and keep it to yourself, it always bounces back again and springs away. You can't keep it in one life. If it's really God's mercy, if it's the authentic mercy of God, it won't stay in your life. It will spring from you into the life of somebody else. That's just the nature of God's mercy. That is the heart of Jesus. Jesus had everything he needed. He didn't need to come to earth. He didn't need to go hang out with those sinners. But the heart of God is always to reach out with his grace and his mercy and pull others up, heal others, encourage others. And he's never dragged down by us. We're always pulled up by him. This message is so timely for us because this is an issue that we struggle with. So our culture is more and more pulling away from the morals and the ethics that come with the spiritual life of following Jesus. And it is creating great tension in our lives and in the life of the church, and tension between us and the culture that's surrounding us. How many parents now are sitting in churches around the country this morning whose sons and daughters are engaged in a lifestyle that they cannot affirm? How many? And it breaks their hearts. And many times they don't know what to do. My son is marrying another man. Should I go to the wedding? My daughter has a relationship with another woman. Should I allow her to come to the house? These are real questions. These are difficult issues because real believers don't want to affirm a sinful lifestyle. And so the holiness in us says, I can't say yes to that lifestyle, but the mercy in us pulls our heart apart and says, but I love that person and I don't want to lose them. There's two very easy solutions to this problem. Very simple. Here's the first one. The first one is to say that when you don't live up to the standard of holiness that I believe in, then you don't exist as far as I'm concerned. I disown you. That's not Jesus. In fact, that's who the Pharisees were. And Jesus is chipping away at them, trying to tell them, no, you've taken this whole holiness thing, you've misunderstood it. Now, the other extreme, the other simple answer, that's the wrong answer, but it's an easy one. It's easy just to tell people, you don't live up to my standards, I won't have anything to do with you. Simple, nice, neat, clean, tidy. You're done. Then over here we have people that say, oh, who am I? Maybe I've misunderstood. Maybe we've applied the Bible wrong. Maybe we've interpreted the Bible wrong. We should just forget all of that. As long as we love one another, that's all that matters. That's all that matters. Jesus didn't say that either. Jesus went in there to call the sinners, not to be one. To call the sinners, not to be one. So what we have left is a very difficult solution. It's not as easy as disowning people. It's certainly not as easy as just giving up and being one of them. What we have left is this solution that says we don't give up on holiness, but we don't give up on people either. We love them, just like Jesus loves them. And you say, but Richard, that's impossible. And I would say to you, you're right. It is impossible. But the good news is we have a God who does the impossible. And so it is actually possible to hang on to holiness and to hang on to the mercy of God at the same time. Woo! Those are two big things to hold on to, and you better get ready because you're in for quite a ride. But that's where we belong. That's who we are. This really touches my heart, especially because in my time as a prodigal son, I had a father who, I don't know if he could get up and express it with articulate theological terminology, but he did exactly what I'm telling you today. I don't know how he did it sometimes, but I always knew every day of my sinful life that my father loved me, and I also knew that he didn't agree with what I was doing. I knew those two things, and I never doubted them. Somehow he did it. And if he can do it, we can do it too. Would you bow your heads with me? Now listen to me. You know somebody who needs the mercy of Christ. Somebody that needs to be touched by God's grace. And I'm calling you out to the altar this morning. Even before we begin to sing. There's nothing special about the song, okay? It's good, but we can do what we want to. So I'm calling on you right now, for those of you who have this person that needs mercy, I want you at the altar praying for them, praying for God's mercy, praying to give you the ability to hang on to the holiness of God and to express the mercy of God both at the same time. Come on, don't wait. I know you're there. Come and pray for them. Come now, don't wait. On your knees before God, God, please, show me how to do this. I can't do it. I'm being ripped apart. Or you know another parent who's struggling with this. You have a friend whose son is gay or daughter is in a place where she's destroying herself with drugs, and they're just being torn apart, and they need your encouragement. You need to support them and say, hey, I know what you're going through, and I'm praying for you that you will be able to hold on to the holiness of God and that you will be able to express the mercy of God to your daughter. I know it's impossible, but God will help you do it. God will help you do it. Let's cry out to the Lord now. We can't do this without Him. It's impossible. We've got to have Him show us to do it. We've got to be following Jesus. Jesus knows how to do this. He showed us today that this is what He does, and He does it well. Now, here's the other part of the invitation this morning. Maybe you are here today and you need the mercy of God in your life. You've never confessed God. You've never confessed Jesus as your Savior. I want you to notice today that Jesus didn't come up to Matthew and say, look, I want you to be my follower. You just, do that on your own, by yourself, in your spirit, at home, in your privacy of your closet. No, He said, you get up in front of everybody, and you walk and you follow me, and let them know that you're following me. In another place, Jesus says, if you confess me before men, I will confess you before the Father. If you won't confess me before men, then I'm not going to confess you. You haven't been saved until you get up and confess Jesus as your Lord. That's just the way it works. This is not a transaction that can be done entirely in private. It has to be public. And I'm giving you the opportunity this morning, if you've never made your decision to follow Jesus public, right now I want you to get up and come forward and say, I'm ready. I'm ready to go public. I am a follower of Jesus. You need to rededicate your life to the Lord. You need to join the church. You need to be baptized. Whatever God is saying to you, now is the time to do that. You come forward and let us pray with you, and you make that decision. Let's stand and sing right now. Come on. What is your decision? Make it today. Make it now.